I kid you not, days after our last video was released, showing all these in-depth reasons why MSAA had a manufactured downfall and why it's completely viable with modern affordable hardware, this NVIDIA page that documented various aspects of MSAA and deferred rendering, a site that has been up for more than a decade, all of a sudden was taken down right after we made that video. So we're going to continue our research by measuring the settings usually set by content creators, along with a few commands you can read about in the pinned comment. This is to explain why performance is so bad with these unoptimized settings, as 60 FPS at 1080p on a desktop 3060 is barely possible. This is the frame that we captured, so let's go right ahead. First, the pipeline processes 6 shadow map cascades for the sun/moon light. All of these are rendered with 32-bit precision and take under 1.3 milliseconds to process. Then, a 384 by 384 reflective shadow map, or RSM, is rendered, outputting 3 render targets and a depth buffer. On-screen geometry is rendered from this perspective to provide a rough estimate of world space information required to approximate global illumination. This data is then processed by the GPU to produce 3 indirect lighting atlases that will be represented on screen with spherical harmonic probe lighting. Like you would see with Frostbite's Need for Speed 2015, only the depth stencil buffer is cleared for the base pass and pre-pass processing. The pre-pass is slower than usual because it also outputs additional results to the normal/roughness render target, causing slow pixel invocations that wouldn't exist with standalone depth rendering. The first half of the base pass outputs 4 different render targets along with the depth stencil. This R32 stores the scene depth at a higher precision than the depth stencil buffer, and this R8 stores data related to parallax occlusion mapping. In comparison with a non-MSAA pipeline, this pass is 34% slower with 2x MSAA enabled. This next portion of the base pass doesn't render any additional depth and renders parallax occlusion detail on top of existing geometry. In the 2x MSAA pipeline, this pass is 29% slower. At first, it seems like the 2x MSAA base pass cost adds up to a full millisecond. But this is a debugging illusion that dissipates when the entire base pass portions are measured together, revealing a 0.8 millisecond cost induced by 2x MSAA. Considering how extremely geometrically dense the scene is and how much it lacked in terms of a more optimized pre-pass, 2x MSAA performance hit is pretty forward-looking. While the MSAA cost will grow later in the pipeline, if you remember that this base pass will provide the rendering density of 4x SSAA at 60 FPS, 0.8 milliseconds really isn't too bad. The R32 depth buffer and normal buffer are passed through sub-resource resolve draws in place of copy resource draws, where the sample frequency data is blended into a single pixel value. These are used alongside the decal draws that project data into the original multi-sampled render targets. The relevant render targets are cleared just before the standalone sample 0 data is copied into their non-multi-sampled counterparts. This is a very different step from the sub-resource resolve, which wrote to the same render targets beforehand. Take notice that the sample 0 depth stencil only derived data from the MSAA R32, and 2 different non-MSAA R32 buffers are created. The sample 0 variant is used in the alternating pixel frequency passes, whereas the second non-MSAA R32 is exclusively used in the visual effect pass. This is apparently a performance hack explained in the Crysis 3 rendering documents. The inadequate MSAA stencil mask is also produced in this draw, which has its sensitivity slightly altered to maximize worst-case scenario shading timings. The base pass stencil is almost cleared by a quad, before having the MSAA stenciled rendered inside of it. The higher precision R32 depth is MIP-chained and used to create a number of formats just before the indirect lighting atlases have their alpha channel data refined. SSDO is shaded using a pre-computed noise texture and non-multisampled resources. It is denoised with a depth-aware smoothing pass, all done at native resolution. A 4K by 4K shadow map atlas, later used as a close-up cascade, has a 1K by 1K portion reserved for a local scene light. This allocation is repeated for another light source. A small 64 by 1 RGBA8 is cleared for a small bit of rendered information, and is then used in the main ambient lighting pass, which does not use the non-multi-sampled render targets in the pixel frequency pass. This is where the light pre-pass begins, and is followed by a few non-stenciled small lights. A screen space reflection pass begins afterwards. This pass is partially denoised with a depth-aware blur, and is then fully denoised with another depth-aware blur as it's shaded exclusively into the specular prepass. Merging a secondary smoothing pass with what would usually be a separate composite stage is an optimization no other channel but this one would bring awareness to. And this leads us to an important topic, as this video and many of our data-packed analysis require backbreaking hours of work to create. YouTube's revenue is extremely unrewarding unless your monthly views break into the millions or unless you produce videos on a daily or few-day basis, none of which our efforts fall into because our topics are so niche yet complex, requiring quadruple plus checking that delay our releases, consultation input, and specialized communicative writing that both consumer and developer can understand. These videos would not be possible without our current Patreon members, but we need viewers like you to aid in the sustainability of our work. As I stated in our channel FAQ, we want to expand, but that's extremely reliant on community support. So if you finish the video and continue to learn, take a look at your budget and see if you can spare a small percentage for our monthly subscription to get exclusive access to behind-the-scenes rendering data and a shout-out in all of our videos, knowing you're raising the value of real optimization. Please enjoy the rest of the video. The indirect lighting is shaded exclusively into the diffuse prepass, but only with a pixel frequency pass. This, of course, means a negative visual impact on MSAA. This is easily seen in a secondary capture. Several lights, mostly non-shadowed, are shaded with stencil logic akin to Fox engine quality, but these lights are shaded without any stencil logic outside of sample and pixel frequency shading. The SSDO is then exclusively composited on the diffuse prepass at pixel frequency. World space water ripples are updated, and while the result is occluded from this perspective, it is only shaded at a pixel frequency. A quad is used to clear the shadow map atlas instead of a hardware clear, incurring a 10 times worse cost than needed. After the shadow contents render faster than the clear, the MSAA stencil alpha channel is cleared with a quad, followed by several geometry draws that write cascaded shadow bounds within the non-MSAA depth stencil. These stencil values are used to project the cascaded shadows on that previously cleared alpha channel with additional cloud shadows. This shadow mask is used in the deferred resolve stage, where the light prepass data and albedo specular are combined into a single RGBA16 as the final directional light is shaded. The stencil is then prepared for QMAP forward shading, which is done for certain reflective objects like enemies and weapons. The current stage is saved in a sub-resource resolved RG11B10, but is never called again in the pipeline. Subsurface scattered materials like alien flesh are forward rendered next. Half-resolution volumetric fog utilizes several cascaded shadow maps with pre-computed noise. This is quickly smoothed and shaded onto the scene. A half-resolution non-MSAA copy of the scene is made so that water reflections can be shaded. 2 non-MSAA scene copies are created for the effect pass. Then several resources are created for the depth of field, which have no effect in this frame. Motion blur draws take place in between the depth of field pass, starting with animated motion vectors, followed by motion blur shading with a half-resolution downscale of the motion vectors. Bloom processing begins next, followed by tone mapping, which provides two 24-bit colored outputs, each render target containing different subsample values. Then a non-multi-sampled RGBA16 is recycled for composite screen effects. The final steps for anti-aliasing are computed next. SMAA uses one of the tone-mapped RGBA8s to produce a stencil and edge mask. That edge mask is used alongside SMAA's pre-computed edge detection textures to create a blend mask. The pixel shader invocations remain low because of the stencil created beforehand. The RGBA8 used before is copied to another render target with edge detection smoothing applied. The same thing is done with the second tone-mapped RGBA8, except the smoothing pass combines the result with the last smooth tone-mapped RGBA8. The result at this stage is called SMAA S2X, and it takes about 0.4 milliseconds to resolve when you account for the related render target clears. The next step composites the screen space effects, but also incorporates the SMAA 2TX logic. But instead of reprojecting the previous SMAA frame, like SMAA 2TX would normally do, the previous SMAA S2X frame is projected, which is why it's referenced as SMAA 4X. The UI is drawn and composited on the final frame before it's sent to the display. The final millisecond budget matches up pretty well with the in-game FPS and GPU utilization. If we isolate the main outliers and optimize them collectively by a modest 20%, that's an extra 9 frames on this hardware. Again, this is a very modest estimation because we can easily subtract the cost of half of these based on performance standards this channel has measured in other analyses. For instance, Days Gone displays a much better distance ratio for open-world shadow maps that only uses 4 cascades. Also notice how increasing the shadow map resolution based on what was observed in that game doesn't really compare to the 7-level cascade cost in Crysis 3. Days Gone also displays a more optimized micro-detailing system, shadow projections, and compute shader-based indirect lighting updates. The micro-detail system in Crysis 3 introduces a lot more overdraw, and another 0.2 milliseconds could be easily clawed back with more elaborate pre-pass and draw sorting logic. I personally have a very strong dislike for reflective shadow maps, because they're very inaccurate and limited. The data sampled by RSMs could be baked down at a higher/more accurate frequency, and could then be compressed based on averaged data. That explanation might need a dedicated video, but let's go ahead and move on. SSDO is not only expensive to sample, but prone to dated SSAO artifacts, like haloing in comparison with cheaper and better looking horizon-based techniques shown in previous analysis. Now these aspects are a little harder in terms of estimating a more optimized timing, since they're either much more conditional or lack comparable engine counterparts measured on this channel. Though I do want to discuss the visual effects, which in other scenes can be really heavy due to full resolution shading, and extremely dense geometry. The newer CryEngine versions, such as the one used for Crysis 2 Remastered, provides half-resolution effect shading, but suffers from half-resolution artifacts that Fox Engine solved 6 years before this title. Half-resolution effects in modern CryEngine suffer from an extremely incompetent solution, as it only shades the result on a single buffer, while still using extremely dense triangles instead of simple quads. The Phantom Pain, on the other hand, which cost a lot more in this scene due to extreme overlap and larger effects on screen, shades 2 versions of the effect within a singular draw, each containing different depth discontinuities based on a min-max depth input buffer, while a min-only depth buffer is used for hardware z-testing, which culls occluded pixels from being evaluated. The difference between modern half-resolution effects and Fox Engine's default result is extremely apparent, and you can even see a big difference in the graphs. Anti-consumer, vendor-exclusive technologies like DLSS thrive on this kind of graphics incompetence, because in motion, the low-resolution artifacts manufacture more unneeded temporal instabilities. When you use settings that are reasonable, 60 FPS with 2 times MSAA is provided, with plenty of headroom for conditional action. But many people like to justify worse performance in newer games because they supposedly look better, which 90% of the time isn't true, and our channel proves that. But what nobody accounts for is the fact that newer games also have the opportunity to build off of newer, optimized research, and that's what people need to see when they look at Crysis 3 performance. And that's what people need to recognize as a lacking factor in modern engines. If you would like to learn more about graphics rendering, what makes graphics truly great, and what real optimization is instead of lies based on incompetent temporal anti-aliasing, binge watch our content in order of release, and you will be ahead of most developers in the industry. And make sure to subscribe, because that shows the industry that their customers, including developers, are waking up to graphical incompetence. Until the next video.